Good morning, everybody, and happy Friday. It's the end of the week, and today we are talking about plant reproduction. As promised, this is a recorded video for your folder today since we were not able to go over it in the live lesson yesterday. So today for this recording, I am going to go through the virtual scavenger hunt. So as long as you're watching, you get free answers and you get some explanations on these important parts of the flower and how plants reproduce, because next week you're going to be going on a little field trip around the world to look at different types of plants, and you're going to have to use your knowledge of plants to draw inferences and answer some thinking questions about those plants that you are visiting. So again, today we are focusing on plant reproduction. Okay, so let's get started going on an adventure. So the first thing that we want to go over is plant parts. So we know that there's the stem and the roots, the xylem, the phloem, the leaves, all involved in that in the transport of materials into and throughout the plant. That xylem is transferring water and minerals up the plant through the roots to the leaves. And then the phloem is transferring those sugars made from photosynthesis, carbon dioxide, water, everything else, and hormones up and down the plant through the phloem. So the other parts of the plants, the flowers, are involved in reproduction. Now, the flowers are used for sexual reproduction. So here we are seeing the male and female gametes coming together half and half to create a zygote, or in this case, it will create seeds. And those will be the offspring. They are more genetically diverse because they are getting a combination of alleles of their genetic material from two parent gametes. And we know that gametes are genetically unique because of crossing over and meiosis. So we will also talk about asexual reproduction, but right now we're focusing on sexual reproduction, and we're specifically talking about flowers. So the first slide, you are going to go to a site that is going to show you, and you're going to explore the parts of a flower. So we're going to go to the website, and we're going to explore the parts of a flower. So here it says the flower parts. So flowers are important in making seeds. And we know that seeds are what you put in the ground to make new plants, right? So you've probably tried to grow like pumpkin seeds after you carve those pumpkins, and you kind of like sort of get the pumpkin plant, but then it kind of fails. You never actually get to see the pumpkin. It's a lot harder to take care of plants than you think it is. Some are easier than others. But anyways, they come from flowers. So they're important in making seeds. Flowers can be made up of different parts, but there are some parts that are basic equipment. So the majority of flowers have these basic structures. So the main flower parts are the male parts, which we call the stamen, and the female parts that we call the pistil. Another name for the female parts is the carpel. So let's break this down, male and female parts. So the stamen, the male parts of the flower, has two parts. We have the anther and the filament. So the anther is what creates the pollen. That's why when you like pick up the buttercup flowers, like those little pink ones that you find on the side of the road, they're growing everywhere, and you put them to your nose, we used to do this when we were a kid, you get all that little pollen on your face. It's because it's coming off the anthers, and they're held up by the filament. So the anthers carry the pollen. These are generally yellow in color. Anthers are held up by the thread-like part called the filament. Okay, so now onto the female parts of the flower. There are more parts of the female part of the flower because just like in humans, animals, other organisms, we have male and female. Female parts is what actually carries and grows the offspring. So there are some more parts here. Okay, so we have the pistil or the carpel, which includes all of the female parts. So at the very top is the stigma. Below that is the style, because females have style, right? And then there's the ovary and the ovules. Okay, so these all make up the female parts of the flower, the pistil. Okay, so the pistil has three parts: the stigma, style, and ovary. And then the ovules are the eggs inside of the ovary. The stigma is the sticky surface at the top of the pistil. It's kind of easy to remember. The stigma is sticky. It traps and holds the pollen, and the pollen comes from the anthers. So when the pollen is released from the anthers, it sticks to the stigma on the top of the style. It's sticky, okay? The style is a tube-like structure that holds up the stigma, and the style leads down to the ovary that contains the ovules. We'll talk about pollination here in a second. We're just focusing on the plant part or the flower parts right now, okay? Now let's talk about those pretty things we call petals. So petals are actually modified leaves, and plants have adapted these petals to be different vibrant colors and shapes because they want to attract pollinators. And when we talk about pollination, petals play a really important part in that role. So the other flower parts that are important are the petals and the sepals. These are modified leaves. So petals attract pollinators and are usually the reason why we buy and enjoy flowers. They smell good, they have pretty colors. My personal favorite flower, I love stargazer lilies. They're the really big ones and the bright colors. You generally see them around Easter with the Easter lilies. And you can see all the plant parts on those. We have time, I'll pull up a picture and we'll label the parts of a lily. Easy to see, okay? So the sepals are the green petal-like parts on the base of the flower. So the sepals help protect the developing bud. So before the flower blooms, you can see the sepals, they cover the flower before it blooms and they help protect it. So flowers can have either all male parts or all female parts or a combination. Flowers with all male and or all female parts are called imperfect flowers. So they only have one or the other. This includes like cucumbers, pumpkins, and melons. And then flowers that have both male and female parts are considered perfect flowers. So this includes like roses, lilies, and dandelions. Now, it's not to say that flowers are imperfect or perfect. It's just talking about perfect flowers have all the machinery necessary to reproduce on their own. Whereas imperfect flowers, you require a male flower and a female flower to reproduce. So now we're going to go back to our notebook and we are going to label the parts of the flower. So I'm going to exit out here if I can get there so we can click and drag. Okay, so now we're going to click and drag these labels onto the interactive notebook. I'm only going to do a few and then you're going to do the rest on your own. Okay, so we got a lot of pieces here, but everything we just covered was on the website. So as long as you were paying attention, it's really easy to label, okay? So let's start with the male parts of the flower, the male parts. So the stamen. So the stamen includes the filament and the anther. The anther is what produces the pollen, and it's on the top of the filament. Okay, so number 6 here is our anther. So I'm going to click and drag the anther over to number 6. Number 7 is the filament. So that is the tube-like structure that holds up the anther. And we know that the female or the male parts combined, that is the stamen. See, I've even color-coded it for you. All the blue labels are the male parts of the flower. Okay, and then I want you to label the female parts of the flower on your own. Okay, I do want to go over one here together, and that is the receptacle. The receptacle, also called the nectary, this is where the nectar is created or made. It's right below the ovary. Okay, so you're going to do the rest on your own, click and drag, and then when you're completely finished, you'll submit. Okay, so parts of a flower. Flowers are important for sexual reproduction in flowering plants. We call flowering plants angiosperms. Angiosperms. Now, there are also other plants that don't produce flowers per se in fruit, but they produce cones. We call those gymnosperms, and they also reproduce using pollen and the ovary and the ovules, but they don't have necessarily flowering parts. But angiosperms, flowers, are used for sexual reproduction. We need to know those basic parts because they play an important role in reproduction in flowering plants. Okay, again, you're going to label the remaining on your own. So on the next slide, you are going to type the function of each part of the flower. So the stigma, ovary, anther, style, petals, and sepals. And then tell me if it's male or female. Again, you can get that from the website, okay? Now we're going to move on to pollination. So pollination, once you've got all the structures and machinery for the flower, pollination is what actually reproduction is, or the process of reproduction. So here it says click here. We're going to go to this website now, and we're going to watch a video about pollination. So we're going to watch it together. I'm going to pause and make some comments, and then we'll go back to the notebook, okay?
Zoe? Hey, Zoe. Where you at?
Hey, RJ. What do you think of my garden?
I think you should hold very still. There was a bee on you.
RJ, bees are just as important as me when it comes to gardening.
They are?
Yeah, I need these little guys to pollinate the flowers to help them make more seeds.
Well, bees may pollinate, but bees also sting. No one needs that.
Exactly how much do you know about flowers?
They smell good.
You know that flowers have both male and female parts, right?
I know they have petals.
Petals are important. The sepals, these little things, hold the petals closed until the flower is ready to bloom. When its petals unfold, the flower is ready to be pollinated.
Okay, so are the petals the female parts?
Nope, the pistil is the female part. It's made up of the stigma, style, and ovary.
Okay, and where are the guy parts?
The male part of the flower is called the stamen. It contains the filament, the anther, and the pollen. Pollination is when a pollen grain from the flower's anther reaches the flower's stigma.
Pretty crazy how bees know the drill when it comes to pollinating.
Bees and insects are huge flower fans. They like flowers for their beautiful colors and their pretty smells. But they can eat the flower's pollen and use the nectar to make honey too. That keeps them moving from flower to flower.
Seems simple enough.
It does, huh? But there's a lot more to it than just moving the pollen from flower to flower. That pollen grain has quite a journey ahead of it.
You mean the flower can't make more seeds yet?
Nope. Pollination is step one. To make more seeds, fertilization has to happen. Fertilization is when a pollen grain travels down the style and combines with an egg cell in the ovary.
Yeah, that does not sound simple.
Let's
Okay, so just going to quickly pause and we're going to rewind back to meiosis, what we've already talked about before. So we know that the female gametes, those are the ovules, the eggs, and then the male gametes is the sperm. And here for flowers, it's pollen. So when those come together, they're haploid. When they come together for fertilization, it makes a diploid seed. So in flowers, the male gamete is the pollen, and the female gamete is the ovules. Pollination is that process of bringing them together, and fertilization is whenever it reaches the ovary. So pollen reaches the stigma, goes down into the ovary, and then the pollen fertilizes the ovules to make the zygote.
see if I can get you tuned in. The pollen grain has to travel down to the egg in the ovary. Think of it as a game.
How about basketball? The pollen is a basketball and the egg is the hoop, the goal.
Yeah, the pollen basketball lands on the stigma, and it travels down the style toward the ovary. When pollen combines with the egg cell, fertilization happens and a new seed is made.
Who knew flowers had so much going on?
I did.
Well, let's see how well I kept score. Inside its petals, flowers have male and female parts that work together to make seeds. The male part is the stamen, made up of the filament and the anther. That's where pollen is made. The female part is the pistil. The stigma, style, and ovary are part of the pistil. When pollen is moved from the anther to the stigma, that's called pollination. And when the pollen makes it to the ovary and combines with an egg, that's called fertilization.
And that's how flowers make seeds.
I'm on mute, my bad. So I'm actually gonna go back to the first site that we were at with the flower parts because it has a really good description for pollination. So we're gonna go over here. Okay. So pollination. So when pollination occurs, pollen moves from the male parts to the female parts. So the pollen grains land on the stigma, and a tiny tube grows from it down to this, down through the style to the ovary. The fertilized ovule becomes the seed, and the ovary becomes the fruit. Yes, the fruits that you eat are ripened flower ovaries. But they taste good, right? So a fruit is any ripened ovary that has seeds in it. So a lot of the vegetables that we eat are actually fruit. We generally give the name fruit or vegetable based on how they taste, if they're sweet, if they're crunchy. But any food that you eat that has seeds in it is a fruit. It's the ripened ovary, and they all come from a flower. Okay. So since flowers can't move, they need to be able to attract pollinators or be built so that the wind is able to pollinate them. So there's other types of pollination. The wind can pollinate flowers, water can pollinate flowers, or pollinators can pollinate flowers. Saying a lot of pollen around here. So because some flowers have both male and female parts, they can self-pollinate. And then the flowers that have male or female parts can cross-pollinate. Now, just because it has both male and female parts doesn't mean that it's going to pollinate on its own all the time. That's what pollinators are for. They pick up a little pollen here and then they spread it over there. That's cross-pollination, and that will increase genetic diversity amongst the offspring, as you have pollen and eggs from two different plants coming together to create their offspring. Okay. That's why you might see different colored flowers, because they have different alleles for petal color on the same plant, plants that are next to each other. They're the same species, but when you cross-pollinate, you can mix up those alleles to get different petal colors. So cross-pollination is between two different flowers, and self-pollination is within one flower. Okay. So flowers attract pollinators like bees, butterflies, insects, and birds with sweet nectar, bright colors, and shapes and structures. Now, not all flowers are sweet and pretty. You will learn about a different type of flower in your discussion called the corpse flower that actually smells horrible and doesn't look pretty at all. These are adaptations that plants have to attract certain types of pollinators, the ones that have been that come to that flower for that reason, to help spread that pollen to other plants of the same species. Okay, so more you know. Some flowers open at special times to attract pollinators, such as night blooming plants that are pollinated by bats. So these are all different adaptations to attract specific and certain pollinators. We are most familiar with bees, and they're everywhere. Well, not as much anymore. So bees are really important in pollination, and that's how we get the majority of our foods in the grocery store, our fruits and vegetables. So that's why we got to protect those bees, because without bees and butterflies, those flowers aren't getting pollinated. So next time you see a bee, don't squash it. They're very important in the pollination process. Okay, so we're gonna go back to the interactive notebook. And in this slide, you are putting together the steps of pollination. So we know the first step of pollination is that pollen from the anther has to attach or stick to the stigma. That can be through a pollinator, that could be through, wind or water, whatever method it takes to get the pollen from the anther to the stigma. It may be from another flower, it may be from the same flower. Okay, so here we have pollen is released from the anther. That is the first step. Once it's released from the anther, it needs to stick to the stigma. Okay, so pollen is transferred to the stigma by wind, water, or a pollinator. Okay. Then the pollen tube forms down the style to the ovary. So to get that male gamete, that pollen grain down to the female gametes in the ovary, we'll just go over all this one together. Okay. And then the pollen grain fertilizes the ovule, the eggs in the ovary. And then the fertilized ovule becomes a seed, and the ripened ovary becomes the fruit. Pollination. It's very important. That's how sexually reproducing flowers reproduce. It makes up the majority of foods that we eat, are fruits and vegetables, corn, bananas, cucumbers, melons. Fun fact, broccoli actually makes up many different types of foods that you eat, just depending on what part of the plant that you actually eat. Broccoli, the heads of broccoli are actually the flowers. So when you eat broccoli heads, it's the flowers. Brussels sprouts are the buds. Had some delicious Brussels sprouts last night. Cauliflower is also part of a broccoli plant that's just been covered by the sepals, which is why it's white and not green. So some plants, you're eating multiple different parts of the plant. Flowers are what creates the fruit. So the part of the plant that has the seeds in it. Cucumbers, pumpkins, melons, bananas, except the bananas now that we don't actually have seeds because they've been cultivated by humans. But you get the point. Ripened ovary becomes the fruit through pollination. Now you're going to do the quick write on your own. So the quick write says some flowers have both male and female parts and are capable of self-fertilization. What would be a disadvantage of only self-fertilization versus cross-pollination with another plant? So think back to what we were talking about with perfect and imperfect flowers. Just because it has both male and female parts doesn't mean it's going to always reproduce on its own. That's what pollinators help do, is they bring a little pollen from this plant over here and sprinkle it over there on those stigmas. So what would be a disadvantage of only getting pollen from its own flower? What you think about that? And you're going to do a quick write. Okay, give me like 2 sentences. Okay. We're going to move on to the last part. So we discussed flowers, the reproductive organs of flowers, and pollination. We talked about the importance of pollinators and how sexual reproduction in flowers contributes to the overall genetic diversity amongst those species and in the ecosystem. Not all plants have flowers, though, and not all flowering plants only reproduce sexually. Plants can also reproduce asexually. So those without flowers, those with flowers, some of them reproduce asexually as well. So let's talk about that for a second. So asexual reproduction, think about it for a second. How many parents are involved in asexual reproduction? So asexual is one parent. Asexual is one parent, okay? So in non-flowering plants, there's only going to be one parent involved. Now think about the genetic diversity of single parent organisms when there's only one parent. Okay, so now let's read about it. So keep that in mind. Now we're going to read about it. You're going to go back. You're going to go to a reader. Okay, got some really great stuff in here. So asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is pretty simple. In plants, there's many different types of asexual reproduction. So let's just go through a few of them really quick, okay? So plants can use both sexual and asexual reproduction to populate different environments. Sexual reproduction provides genetic diversity, which allows adaptation to changing conditions. Asexual reproduction allows well-adapted plants to make many copies of itself. So asexual reproduction, that's cloning. They're making just copies of themselves. So that means that the genetic material of the offspring is going to be identical to the parent. So there's not going to be any variation in those offspring. But those plants that are very well adapted to their environments, asexual reproduction is very efficient because they're already adapted and they're just creating a lot more of themselves to populate the environment. Okay, so there are many different types of asexual reproduction, like I said. We remember talking about asexual reproduction back with bacteria. You had the binary fission and then the conjugation. Plants have different types of asexual reproduction as well. So a plant reproduces by regeneration when a new individual grows from a piece of a stem, leaf, or root that has broken off. The classic example here is like succulents. So if you tear off a part of a succulent, such as like aloe vera, if you pull it from the stem, it will actually start to make a little bud. And you can plant that in the ground and it will grow a new plant. In vegetative reproduction, stems, leaves, or roots that are still attached to the parent plant produce new individuals. And there's a couple different types of this as well. So vegetative reproductive structures. Many plants have structures specially adapted for vegetative reproduction. Stems that grow horizontally along the ground are called runners or stolons. I stick to runners. At certain points along the runner, a new plant grows. An example of this would be strawberries. Strawberries. So let's take a look at a picture of a strawberry. Okay. So here is a strawberry plant. Hold up. Okay. So here we have a strawberry plant. You might not have known it so strawberries have flowers. That's how you get the fruit. But they also reproduce asexually through vegetative propagation. So here are the runners. You see it's coming from the main plant and they stem off to create new plants. Another great picture here. So we got our mother plant, the strawberry, and then the runners grow and they sit in the soil, they grow new roots, and they continue to grow. So they're very well adapted to create many clones of themselves. because there's that berry, that fruit. We know they also have flowers, but remember, some plants reproduce sexually and asexually. So strawberries are a great example of plants that reproduce both ways and show vegetative propagation. Okay, we're gonna go back to our reader. Horizontal underground stems are called rhizomes. New plants grow from buds in the rhizome's joints. Okay, so back to that picture over here. This is over here would be the rhizome. We'll see a couple of those examples in your field trip next week. A tuber is an underground stem modified for storage. Potatoes are tubers. Beets are tubers. Jicamas are tubers. The eyes of the potato are buds that can sprout new plants. Bulbs are underground storage stems surrounded by modified leaves and covered with papery skin. Tulips and onions are bulbs. When conditions are right, bulbs divide and to produce new plants. Okay. So let's talk about humans really quick. So we love to get involved and insert ourselves into all kinds of stuff. Reproduction in plants is no different. So we as humans have cultivated many different types of plants for our own use. Many foods that you eat are cultivated: bananas, potatoes, strawberries. We have selectively picked plants that are best fit for our needs in certain environments, crop fields, to generate what we need. So people use a process called vegetative propagation to grow plants with special traits such as seedless fruits. Bananas, which I just had for breakfast, are a great example of these type of fruits that we have cultivated using vegetative propagation. The bananas that you eat are not like wild bananas. They don't have seeds. Wild bananas actually have a lot of seeds. So because of what we humans have done to propagate and grow new plants without seeds, that's what we get from bananas. Okay, this process uses a plant's ability to reproduce from pieces of a parent plant. There are a few ways to do this. So long story short, humans can use methods of asexual reproduction from plants to take plants that have more favorable traits and use them to grow new plants. So they're not actually pollinating these plants. They're just taking pieces of those plants and growing them because they have those favorable traits. I don't want to change anything about it. Because remember, asexual reproduction, the offspring are identical, genetically identical to the parent. So we find the stuff that we like. And if it's favorable, what we're looking for, we're going to take and make an exact copy of it. And a lot of plants reproduce both ways. Okay. So you're not going to answer the questions down here. You're going to go back to your scavenger hunt, and you're going to answer the questions here. Okay, so for these two questions, we just talked about asexual reproduction in plants. So the first one says, provide 2 reasons why a plant grower would use vegetative propagation. That's in that last little paragraph at the bottom. Okay, and then lastly, if genetic diversity is so important, why do plants have the ability to use asexual reproduction? So you got to think about sexual reproduction in flowering plants, and then you also got to think about asexual reproduction, because remember, some plants do both. Many plants do both. So why would plants that can reproduce sexually choose to reproduce asexually? Got to pull that knowledge together. Okay. When you are done with your scavenger hunt, you need to copy it over to your student notebook and submit through Schoology. That is my lesson over flowers, plant reproduction. If you need to go back and rewind to rewatch any parts of this lesson, please do so. And if you have any questions at all, please shoot me a message. We can meet, or you can just ask a question and I'll answer the best that I can. Okay, make sure you get your Friday folder completed and you have all of the other folders from this week completed. Grades are due at noon. Okay, grades are due at noon for the 3 weeks progress report. You'll have a wonderful day, and I will see you guys next week.